Well, we're glad you're all here. We know exams are still going on, and this is not the easiest time to come, so we appreciate your being here. My name is Dan McGraw. I teach in the ILO and the ERE and the conflict resolution mixture, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. This project is unusually ambitious. It not only dealt with 3 different countries, but it dealt with very sensitive and difficult issues that fall at the intersection of 2 of the defining realities that we're all facing. One of those, of course, is not new, and that's that we all rely on the environment for our civilization because of ecosystem services, and this is the natural environment I'm talking about. And many of the people that these folks interacted with rely on the environment in a much more basic way for basic sustenance and that sort of thing. So that's one of the realities. The other is that the environment is under increasing pressure, and I'm sure you know this, but there's increasing encroachment on wild areas or rural areas. There's a great extinction of species going on. There's different kinds of pollution, some of which is virtually invisible, but almost all of which is growing. There's climate change. The list could go on, and in most of those areas, the indices are going the wrong direction. That is, things are increasing the pressures on the environment. And caught in between these 2 realities are the people that we're going to talk about today. These are individuals who decide to protect their family or their communities, and most of them don't think of themselves as environmentalists at the beginning, and almost none of them think in terms of human rights. This is my experience, at least. And one of the challenges that we face is how to get human rights tools and resources to them quickly. Another challenge is how to keep them alive. It turns out this is almost the most dangerous thing to be. There are over 3 people, that is 3 of these environmental human rights defenders killed per week around the world, murdered per week around the world. So there's a real challenge just to maintaining their physical safety. So what we're talking about here and what you'll hear about are some exceedingly brave people, although I think they probably don't know that number of 3 people getting murdered every week, but they know that they're often endangered. So with no more introduction than that, I'd like to turn it over to Tiffany, who will lead this roundtable and tell you, I think at the beginning, a little more about the study itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McGraw, and we also have to thank Professor McGraw for inspiring this project. And I think that all your comments were completely spot on with the experiences that we had in all the case study countries. So what I want to do is give you an overview of the clinic, and then a little bit about the project, and then the format for this roundtable discussion. So the International Human Rights Clinic's an experiential learning course at SAIS. It's project focused. For the past couple years, it's been report and fact-finding based. Some past projects include migrant domestic workers in the Philippines and Kuwait, child labor in Turkey, nationality and regularization laws in Dominican Republic, and last year was the migration crisis along the Dominican Republic-Haiti border. Most of these reports are available online for you to read on our new Human Rights Clinic website. The students complete all aspects of the project. This year, even more so than past years, they were allowed to pick their countries of case study. They do all the background research, figure out who the relevant stakeholders are. They do all the communications and even the layout for the report, which is currently in production. So it's a really full circle experience. With regards to this particular issue, there are 3 main reasons for the study of this issue. The first is to commemorate the 800th anniversary of the Carta de Foresta. The second was inspired by the Goldman Environmental Prize. And the third is to recognize all the heightened struggles of environmental human rights defenders around the world, which is something Professor McGraw alluded to. You're going to hear this term a lot, so I'm just going to say it right now. Environmental human rights defenders, we call them EHRDs for short, because as it turns out, environmental human rights defender is a pretty long phrase, and it's even longer when you translate it into Spanish. So when you hear that acronym, just be cognizant, but they could be known by many other names: environmental activists, environmental protectors. We'll also use the term forest defenders, which I think will be explained more in the presentations. So we chose 3 case studies: Kenya, Peru, and Sri Lanka, to look at the situation of forest defenders. We examined the different social, economic, political, cultural, and legal landscapes of these countries, as well as the environmental and land rights that the EHRDs were fighting to protect. We also looked at the challenges to their work, their advocacy work, and also the threats to their human rights. Structurally, in the fall, we began broadly looking into the issue of environmental human rights defenders. Then we decided our country case studies based on a multitude of cross-cutting criteria. Substantively, we looked at whether there were active or current issues with human rights of forest defenders. We were looking at developing country context to provide some parity across the research, and we were looking for the involvement of indigenous populations also as a point of comparison. We also have logistical criteria. As you can imagine, as a human rights clinic, funding's an issue. So we had to consider cost, but we also had to consider political stability and the safety of our researchers. So a few of our prospective case study countries were nixed for different logistical concerns, including the death of a king, which was going to cause political stability issues. The costs, where did you guys want to go? Madagascar. Yeah, Madagascar is really expensive. And we thought about Cambodia, but Cambodia is one of the most dangerous countries for environmental human rights defenders. And upon talking to people, we didn't think we were going to get very far into the case study or safely be able to carry out the case study. So we have the current countries before you. So then we broke up into different case study teams, which I'll introduce the case studies teams. We continued the background research more in depth on those different countries. We drafted a research questionnaire and complied with our institutional review board requirements to gain approval. And then the students began to prepare for their in-country fact-finding, which all occurred over winter break. And then in January, the 3 teams spent about a week in each of the respective countries, meeting with different actors, NGOs, individual activists, government agencies, IOs, to conduct interviews. And then when we came back in the spring semester, we reviewed all the field work, followed up, conducted additional interviews remotely, and began outlining and drafting the report, of which I'm sure they can. Well, for those of you who live with them, you know what their experience has been like over the past week. So it's been a very intense sprint to publication, and currently, as I mentioned, the report is in layout, and we think it'll be published by Friday of this week, of which we encourage you to read all what we suspect is about 150 pages or so. So now allow me to introduce the team. I should note, well, this is an international law and organizations course, but there are a lot of different levels of expertise in the group. We have a few IDEV minors, a CM minor, our much needed environmental resources and energy, sorry, I put the environment first, where it should go. Energy concentrator, as well as general international relations. So to my left is the Kenya team, Caitlin Erskine, Sarah Sabah, oh, sorry. I didn't, you guys are in different orders than I had you on my sheet. And Anna, let me try this. Vasudevan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then to my right, we have the Sri Lankan team. And to Zinian, yeah, that does not sound right to me. Okay, Miller. Ruchetta Singh and Sarah Golden, thank you for having names I can pronounce. And then on the Peru team is Natalie Tomayor. Oh, thank you. Fabio, why didn't you give me a pronunciation of your last name?
I forgot, I'm sorry.
Ian Nuzelli?
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh. You're killing the Italian part of me right now.
It happens many times.
Madison Wilcox and Katie Hammer, who is also our resident graphic design guru, and who's taking a brunt of our graphic design work. So they've been really active and brilliant, and I'm very proud of all of them and the work that they're producing and that will eventually be published on Friday, I hope. And so let me just introduce the format for today. So we're going to start with a brief overview of the different case studies, and that's going to be followed by several moderated questions, so it's a very interactive format. And then we're going to open up the floor to Q&A and open discussion. I should note that this is being video recorded. It's on the record, so if you want something off the record, say off the record. So it'll be up on the web, and just to speak into the mic whenever you're speaking, just so it can be captured on the video. So with that, please let me introduce Anna, who will start the overview of the case study findings. As you wish. Okay. Do we need the PowerPoint? Yeah.
We didn't tell him that we needed a PowerPoint? Oh, damn.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, it was there.
It's everywhere.
Maybe those?
Yeah, maybe we can dim them a little bit.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tiffany, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. So, as you just mentioned, I'm going to start our case study overview, and I'm going to start talking about the trip that I went on with Sarah and Caitlin to Kenya. So, just to give you an idea, we went to Kenya for a fact-finding mission for about 6 days in January. And we spent most of the time in Nairobi, as you can see on the map, and also traveled to Nakuru and Mount Kenya National Park to visit the Chuka community as well. So before embarking on our trip, we did some desk research and arranged interviews with various stakeholders. We had the opportunity to meet with several NGOs, some that were working on human rights issues, some on conservation issues, and some that worked directly with the local communities. We also got to visit the UN headquarters in Nairobi and met with UNEP and with UNDP, as well as USAID, which is across the street at the embassy. After that, we also got a chance to meet with government representatives at the Kenya Forest Service and individuals, including a professor at the University of Nairobi that was specializing in environmental conservation and human rights issues. And after we came back, we also had a few Skype interviews with experts in the field. And on our trip, as I mentioned before, we met with some of the community members as well. So first, I want to delve in to the issue of forest conservation in Kenya. And just to give you an idea, Kenya's natural resources are tied to its 5 water towers, which are actually watersheds that are spread over 2% of the country's land. And they supply all of the water, energy, food, and resources for the whole country and promote livelihoods for the local populations. Environmental degradation, deforestation, and unsustainable use of the land has threatened these water towers. For example, as of 2015, forest cover has steadily eroded and declined to 7.5% of the country, and the country has now started a reforestation program to reach the goal of 9% forest cover by 2030. Deforestation in Kenya mainly happens as a result of different human activities, as you might imagine: agricultural practices, commercial exploitation, poor governance and management of the land, as well as climate change. In the context of Kenya, we found that the concept of EHRDs, Environmental Human Rights Defenders, is not really a known topic, but in the context of Kenya, it's focused on community-based advocacy. This idea stems from Kenya's colonial history and a land allotment system that started in the 1930s, during which pieces of land were given to particular communities. However, some of these groups were left out of the system because they couldn't provide proper identification to prove their affiliation with the group receiving the land. So as a result, many groups, including the Ogiek and the Sengor, which we'll talk about later, became marginalized and they were excluded. And their ancestrally claimed land was either given to another larger group and they were forced to assimilate into that group, or it was transferred into government-controlled resources under a land trust system. So the 3 communities that we focused on were the Ogiek, as I mentioned, who live in the Mau forest near Nakuru. They've been fighting for their right to live within the forest. They've also fought eviction cases and await a favorable decision. The Chuka community, who live in Mount Kenya, where this photo was taken, their land was actually classified, their community land was actually classified as part of the forest reserve when the park was gazetted. And they seek community-based forest management that gives them the upper hand in dealing with the land that they live on. They currently aren't working with the Kenya Forest Service, but they feel that the KFS makes all the decisions, so they want to change. We also ran into problems of illegal logging, land ownership, and patrolling of the forest. And this is also from Chuka. So the Sangre community of the Cherangani Hills was also was also excluded from this land allotment system, and their land was either given to other groups or converted to the land trust. They also run into the issue as a result of government recognition, and there have been development projects on their land that have forced them to leave, and they've been evicted. And this has caused several human rights violations that they have brought up with the World Bank and in court cases that we'll talk about later. So I can give the floor to the Peru team to talk a little bit about the issues that they saw there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I will introduce our Peru case study that I did with Natalie, Katie, and Signore Fabio. This is a picture that Katie actually took from before our case study began, near Machu Picchu, right? Yeah. So any day. Anyway, Peru case study. So we spent 6 days in January in Peru. The first half of the week we spent in Pucallpa, which is the capital of the Ucayali region, which you can see is one of the easternmost regions of Peru, highly forested, part of the Amazon rainforest. And we met with about 15 organizations, over 20 individuals, comprising government officials, NGOs, human rights lawyers, indigenous activists, and many other groups. And we felt that this provided a pretty balanced perspective of the situation of environmental human rights defenders in Peru. So just, there's Lima. So just in short, we did find that there do exist many threats to environmental human rights defenders, specifically in Ucayali. This was evident from the interviews we had with activists such as Robert Guimarães, seen here, and from past reports of many environmental human rights defenders being killed in the Amazon. And the Amazon rainforest and its defenders face a broad swath of challenges, from illegal logging to agricultural efforts to regulatory gaps and all sorts of other issues that lead to clear cutting of large swaths of the rainforest, as can be seen in this picture. And in Peru especially, and you can see in this picture as well, below there is the city of Pucallpa where we were, and up on the upper left part of the picture we can see some of the clear-cutting Plantaciones de Ucayali and Plantaciones de Pucallpa, which were two of the issue areas in terms of illegal logging in the region. But in Peru especially, these issues are not exclusively having to do with indigenous groups, but they often overlap. These groups are often trying to protect their ancestral land, which is their right to protect as per ILO 169 and as per the Constitution of Peru. And often indigenous protectors of their land have faced death threats, and they've faced public humiliation from what they claim are extractive industries, and from corrupt government officials that are in cahoots with extractive industries. And these reports have been corroborated by indigenous activists, but also from independent researchers in the field who are studying the issue as well. So there's us at IIAP, which they're a group that works on improving the quality of the agricultural land in the Amazon. Our case study focused on just one region of Peru, in Ucayali, and specifically around Pucallpa. However, many of the issues we found that are underlying these tensions between environmental human rights defenders and extractive industries in Peru, according to the researchers we talked to and the NGOs, are prevalent throughout the country and have led to many other problems besides illegal logging, also in the mining sector in the Andes of Peru. So this is on the Ucayali River. So just in short, some of these issues include the separation or the gap between the national laws that govern environmental rights and human rights in Peru, but then the regionalization of enforcement. And these regional governments often don't have the resources to enforce these national laws. There are also problems with land titling. There are many loopholes which allow companies to legally deforest large sections of land in the Amazon. And then there are also discrepancies in the interpretation of what constitutes ancestral land in the Amazon in Peru. One side is arguing a strict constitutional interpretation which affords all of the land to indigenous groups in Peru as their right. And then there's another side which is purported by the Peruvian government, which states that all of the land in Peru is part of El Patrimonio, which is like the patrimony, the ownership of all the people of Peru, so they have the right to decide what to do with it. So these are just a few of the many issues that we highlighted, but we do believe with concerted efforts to, on both sides, to help alleviate a lot of these problems, that there are possible solutions, and I hope our conversation illuminates some of these issues. And that's us in Lima, on the move. Yeah, that was the last night in Lima, the sunset. Anyway, so yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to the Sri Lanka case study.
All right, hey guys. So this is the true story of four strangers, Tiffany, Sarah, Ruchetta, and me, although Sarah and I knew each other before, picked to travel through Sri Lanka in a van for at least 20 hours in the span of 3 days and have their ankles sucked on by leeches to find out what happens when people keep being polite, because let's be honest, Sri Lankans are super nice, and start getting real about forest protectors. I mean, it was basically the real world for anyone who's watched that, but less drama and more research. The Sri Lanka team spent, is that big enough for you guys? Well, spent 6 days in country. 5 of those were spent conducting interviews. In Colombo, the country's capital, we had a call with a former Conservator General of the Forest Department and met with the World Bank and the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. In Kandy, which is in the Central Highlands, right in the middle, we spent a morning with various professors from the University of Perdinea learning about botany, agriculture, and sociology. And in the Knuckles Forest Reserve, we had the chance to speak with 2 forest officers who say that 3 of them are responsible for supervising 10,000 hectares of protected forest land. We also met with people in a village right on the boundary of the Knuckles Forest who were provided housing and services to work on the state's tea plantations. Back in Colombo for the last 2 days, we were part of a panel at the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, met with the rainforest protectors and the Environmental Foundation Limited, which was NGOs working in the country, as well as representatives from UNDP, FAO, and UN Red. So we came across three themes rather than specific case studies that frame the understanding of human rights of forest protectors or even issues that they might face. Much of it can be understood as a legacy of British colonialism and the Civil War, which only ended a few years ago. Basically, you see conflicts between rapid post-war development and environmental conservation. Almost 1/4 of the country's total land size is protected land, and the country's commitment to protecting forests is enshrined in its laws and efforts. And this is a very official photo of us standing in front of the Human Rights Commission before a meeting. We often read and heard that various development issues, even conservation efforts, have been impacted significantly by party politics. The mini hydro projects in Sri Lanka, as well as foreign Chinese investments for development projects in the southern part of the country, the declaration of various UNESCO World Heritage Sites, as well as the prioritization of infrastructure development over social development are some examples of how party politics have impacted the country. Allegations of deforestation at Vilpatu National Park have also taken on a political dimension, divided along ethnic and religious lines. However, several stakeholders insist that the situation should instead be understood as an environmental issue, and that the alleged deforestation and resettlements didn't actually occur within the protected forest land. Second, although we didn't meet with any indigenous communities, we often heard about the Vanila Eto, or Vedas as they're commonly called, who are traditionally a forest-dwelling hunter and gathering people. Ever since the creation of protected forest land between the 1950s and 1980s, they were resettled and traditional livelihoods became criminalized because they couldn't carry out their traditional practices in the forests. They have been afforded some concessions, but the biggest issue lies in the poor health and education outcomes they face and the fact that Sri Lanka hasn't signed the International Labour Organization's Convention on Indigenous Peoples. And this brings me to another minority rights issue, which is that of language barriers given the country's complex demographic. But the government is actually working on addressing that issue. Finally, we came across a tension between industrialization and globalization. There are many conflicts between the issues of environmental and forest conservation between issues of environmental and forest conservation with Sri Lanka's goals of economic and industrial development, such as moving local communities to build an airport or a deep sea port in the south, or the construction of mini hydroelectric dams throughout the country's landscape that are preventing waterfalls from reaching communities in need. These mini hydros are a good example of the complex incentives and priorities of stakeholders. In some cases, officials are pressured by people that are higher up to give excess logging permits to build mini hydros. And then this further disrupts the ecosystem by building dams, for example, that prevent natural watershed management services. The issues of environmentally sustainable development also come up when looking at the foreign direct investment and national investors' impacts on environmental outcomes, further emphasizing the tension between development and sustainability. All in all, Sri Lankans obviously prioritize and understand forest protection and conservation, but given the country's history and the recent end of the Civil War, environmental human rights may lag a few years behind the realization of other rights. No. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Colorful as always. So now we'll turn to the moderated portion of this event. So we'll have 6 questions that I'll pose to the teams, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So the first question is that given that we're focusing on environmental defenders protecting forest land, can you give some context to the challenges managing the forests in the countries studied? And let's start with Natalie from Peru.
To just give you all a better idea of what the rainforest looks like in Peru and why it matters. Peru is home to the 3rd largest area of tropical rainforest in the world, 80% of which is primary forest, which means it's some of the healthiest and most biodiverse forests that exist. The forest in Peru is also home to 330,000 indigenous people who depend on the forest for their livelihoods, as well as for their culture and their spiritual identity. Deforestation in Peru is relatively low. It's 0.3%, especially when compared to some of its Amazonian neighbors, which is a great thing. Most of it's due to subsistence agriculture, however, which is primarily from the migration of farmers from sort of mountainsides to more productive agricultural land, taking advantage of Peru's land tenure law that allows farmers to own land that they occupy and farm for 5 years. Unfortunately, deforestation is actually increasing in Peru as a result of development activities, including logging, mineral extraction, commercial agriculture, and road construction. Most of the logging is selective logging. A lot of it is for mahogany in particular. It is the harvesting of high-value woods that don't necessarily deforest, but more accurately degrade a forest. Though it's not fully clear-cutting a forest, the degradation leads to an increased chances of wildfires and road construction into the forest, which thus lead to forest land being fully cleared for agriculture. Currently, 80 to 95% of logging in Peru is legal, especially for mahogany, which is over 95% legal, with its largest market being the United States. Though illegal logging in Peru and in the US is legal, and it is unfortunately very hard to enforce, even with the protections afforded to it by the Lacey Act and the US-Peru Foreign Trade Agreement. Though they're illegal, the timber certification system is very flawed. It's difficult to trace where illegal logs are coming from. It's illegal to trace, especially when certifications are given to farmers legally, but then they deforest from areas that the certification is not for, which is very common in Peru. Though Peru has committed to reaching zero net deforestation by 2021, there's a lot of barriers in their way for them to achieve this goal. One of them is weak land titling systems, especially for indigenous communities. A lot of indigenous communities in Peru, especially those that live in the Amazon, are given titles to the land that their houses directly fall on. Maybe they're also given titles to the land where their animals graze, but few are given land titles to more land than that, most of which they need to subsist, most of which they need to support their livelihoods. A 2014 study by the World Resources Institute found that strengthening indigenous land titles can lead to a lower rates of deforestation. But even when there are strong land titles and there are laws on the books that protect these things, it's really hard to enforce laws in the middle of the forest when there just aren't enough forest rangers there to be watching. In addition to the 330,000 people that live within the forest and depend on it directly, it's also home to nearly 3,000 fauna species, 16% of which live only in the Peruvian Amazon. In order to protect this rare habitat for species, to combat climate change, and to strengthen the human rights of indigenous peoples, it's really important for Peru to combat deforestation through increasing oversight and monitoring, strengthening the land tenure, and including indigenous people in the decision-making process.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Kenya and Sarah.
So regarding the history and challenges of deforestation in Kenya, the long-lasting legacy of the British colonialism in Kenya, which occurred between the 1920s and the 1960s, has a deep residual impact on the current state of the environment, as well as on the government conservation goals. In particular, during the past century, the economic growth, the country's economic growth brought social and obviously economic prosperity to the Kenyans, but also, unfortunately, deeply impacted the environment and depleted the forest lands. The majority of deforestation in Kenya took place during the 1990s, when the government started to de-gazette, started the phenomenon called de-gazettement, which basically consists in making protected forest areas available for exploitative use. So during this period, the country lost approximately 12,000 hectares of forest lands every year. To remedy against deforestation, Kenya has started during the past decade has implemented political reforms, and in particular in 2005, the country enacted the Kenya Forest Act, which provided for the creation, provided to the sustainable management and conservation of forest areas, and also created this joint management system between the forest communities, which are approximately 84 communities, forest communities now, and the Kenya Forest Service, which is a branch of the government. Kenya also, during the past couple of years, and in particular in 2016, signed several multilateral environmental agreements and also committed to the Bonn Challenge to keep the country pledged to restore up to restore its forest areas up to 9% of the total land area.
Thank you. Finally, Sri Lanka.
So Sri Lanka has a long-standing history of environmental conservation and environmentally friendly ways of living with the environment, which have to do with its Buddhist cultural history as well as its agrarian society that has lived very well in the island ecosystem full of various climates and also the Central Highlands. But during British colonialism, almost 50% of the land was deforested by the British to establish coffee, rubber, and tea plantations. So that was really when the start of deforestation happened in Sri Lanka. But since independence, there have been pushes for conservation of forests from every which way: community groups, religious organizations, government agencies, and international organizations, and civil society orgs within Sri Lanka. Today, the biggest challenges that are facing forest conservation in the country are large-scale agriculture, development projects for post-war resettlement, as well as job creation and industrial development. Also, underlying all of this is really corruption and misaligned incentives for stakeholders that have impacts on the environment, whether it's government agencies or development and construction firms. But throughout the rest of our conversation about Sri Lanka, we'll discuss more in depth some of these issues, and of course you can read our report to find out more.
Thank you for the forecasting. Moving on to our second question, I just want to pause for a moment and give you the most common description of environmental human rights defenders, because we're going to be moving into that topic. So environmental human rights defenders are described as those in their personal or professional capacity, individually or collectively, who undertake peaceful actions to achieve the full realization of rights and fundamental freedoms as they relate to the enjoyment of a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. So it's a very broad definition. In fact, we all are probably environmental human rights defenders. There's lawyers and journalists, and as Fabio noted, farmers, indigenous communities, mothers, there's many, it takes many different forms. Even I saw recently the Lorax, Dr. Seuss. The Lorax was a environmental human rights defender, and in fact should be the poster child for environment. Oh, no, that's true. Yeah. Oh, well. But, so, off the record, sorry. So moving on to environmental human rights defenders in the context of the different countries, can you describe how this concept was received and understood, along with the general landscape for EHRDs, specifically challenges they face to their advocacy or other challenges to their human rights? Starting with Kenya.
So the environmental human rights defenders, women in Kenya and in general, are contrary to the situation in Peru and Sri Lanka. There are many groups and communities fighting for their land rights against the government, and also against international land grabbing and the environmentally unsustainable use of the forest resources by the private sector. So we've noticed during our research that the EHRDs in Kenya face very heavy circumstances in their fight to protect their land. For example, Phyllis Omido, who is the 2015 Goldman winner, the Goldman Prize is a prize which rewards environmental heroes, as a definition. Yes. And she has had to go into hiding in the past couple months because of her activism. She was threatened by organizations. So something to highlight in Kenya is that the government has heavily degraded the work of human rights defenders since their activism is often in opposition to the state objectives. And something to notice as well is that media houses often can face fines when releasing information about human rights defenders, which definitely limits the space for them to exist. We can also notice some improvements, theoretical improvements in Kenya, notably with the 2005 Forest Act, which was a way for the government to give the communities more power and more power to like greater involvement in the forest management. So this is in theory, and we noticed when we were on the field and when we met with the communities that the Kenya Forest Service mostly has like greater power in this joint management relationship.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Rucheta, Sri Lanka?
Sure. EHRDs in Sri Lanka include national and international NGOs who advocate for sustainable development. And an example of this in the Sri Lankan context was the rainforest protectors. Then you have local communities who are promoting the protection of natural resources and the environment through collective participation. Further, you have organizations that promote environment equality and justice through legal means, such as the Center for Environmental Justice and Environmental Foundation Limited. And in the Sri Lankan context, the term EHRDs was not often understood. So when we further elaborated to ask who protects the forest and who are the human rights defenders of forests, we were often directed towards government officials, specifically forest officials and wildlife officials who work on the ground to protect the environment and ecosystems from encroachment and harm. But all in all of these actors work daily to protect the environment and to advocate and ensure that rainforests, wildlife, and nature is conserved. And further, these environmental human rights defenders in Sri Lanka are particularly disadvantaged due to their lack of knowledge about their rights as human rights defenders. They first of all do not identify themselves as a special category of human rights defenders, and this leaves them at a lack of knowledge about their rights. They also, in general, have a lack of knowledge about the legal system and the mechanisms that are in place to help them with their work, and in case of any abuses or violations. In terms of law, the Sri Lankan constitution has a fundamental duty on every person, which says that every person in Sri Lanka has a duty to protect nature and to conserve its riches. And the people of Sri Lanka also enjoy a right to information, which is guaranteed by the constitution. These mechanisms are important for public participation in decision-making, as well as monitoring and evaluating projects and policies. And specifically in the context of environmental human rights defenders, the right to information turns out to be an asset in helping them carry out their work. Sri Lanka is also a dualist country with regards to incorporating international law into domestic law. And the current Sri Lankan constitution does not specifically comprise of any definitive provisions that lay out its relationship between international and domestic law. However, that being said, there's currently a new constitution that's being drafted, and whether the new constitution will include a dialogue on a right to a clean, safe, adequate, and healthy environment remains uncertain at this point. But we did meet with the chair of the Human Rights Commission when we were in Colombo on the first day, Dr. Deepika Udagama, who states that the right to an adequate environment should no doubt be enshrined in the Constitution, and we do hope that Sri Lanka does incorporate this right in its Constitution.
Thank you, Rucheta. Finally, we have Fabio on Peru, and it's his birthday today, so just throwing it out there.
So I've been threatened, thank you, actually.
was more worried about being threatened to be short. Like, please, Fabio, don't speak too much. I hope not to be too short.
Please, Fabio, don't speak too
You know, I had in my mind throughout all this time, but so I hope to be not too short, but trying to give you like an idea of what environmental human rights defenders do in Peru. So, like, one of the things that struck us the most when we were in Peru is when one of the indigenous leaders representing one community in Ucayali told us that they are just a statistic. So, being pretty harsh in basically let us understanding that they are a number. So everybody speaks about environmental human rights defenders when someone is killed, and this is something that definitely we will bring with us, and it's something that has to come out in the work that human rights advocates do. So in Peru, like environmental human rights defenders Tiffany was correctly pointing out, several individuals can be a farmer up in the Andes trying to defend their land from extractive industries trying to exploit her, or like from her house, from her homeland. It can be a community, so indigenous community defending the land where their the ancestors lived for centuries and trying to resist the external pressure. But it could be a forest ranger trying to do his work, protecting the forest, but not having the tools, so being threatened to be killed if it does its work correctly. It can be a journalist, a researcher, and so on, or NGO activist. So the term leaves, it's a very broad definition and leaves space to different kinds of people to carry out this work. Of course, in Peru, like the problem, what we notice is that indigenous groups are environmental human rights defenders most at risk. It is not new. The difference when compared to Sri Lanka is that this term is pretty clear in Peru, especially like since 2006 when during the Bagua accidents there were pretty rough riots and fights between police and indigenous groups in the north of Peru, and several people died both within the indigenous community and in the police forces. So it's a problem that is actually carrying out until today. Like, it's something that is not solved, and there are still a lot of disputes going on. What are the causes why this people is carrying out their protests? But actually, when I was thinking about how to frame, to give you an idea, I was thinking that there is definitely a human perspective and an environmental perspective. So the human perspective is they're trying to stay in their lands, and I'm talking about indigenous people. So a lot of land disputes, a lot of disputes among who has the right to use that land, to live and to use the resources of those lands. There's actually, because sometimes there is this thing that, indigenous people are against these projects. No, there's actually the will to try to be more involved and have something to say about what is going on in their lands. Having participation, which is one fundamental human rights, it's a cross-cutting principle of human rights law. So more accountability, transparency by who comes to exploit their resources. And then there is the environmental perspective, which is actually a different relationship also with the land, with the forest, which means also that the way, a person in Lima interprets the relation with the forest is different as a person in the Ucayali region, in the Amazon forest. So there are these two dimensions that bring them to advocate for their rights. Of course, this is not it's not consequence-free, but as the Signor Madison, to give him back like his Italian addressing, are different, from forced eviction to threats of violence to the individual or to the community or to the families, to actual violence. But also this is an interesting aspect. We a community leader, like there's public defamation in the community. So a community leader that we just met in January, not just, but in January, he was addressed on a local newspaper as a persona non grata, so which caused like a stigma to that person fighting for the community rights. And to go so we have the problem, we have the causes of the problem. So what are the barriers to solve these problems? Well, there are barriers, for example, both on the causes, which are like regarding like land disputes. There's a lot of confusion about interpretation and like procrastination about interpreting who has the right to own who and to use what. So the government, Peruvian state says no, this is part of the el patrimonio. So it's the state, it's all the Peruvian people, while indigenous people clearly, of course, and also under international legal instruments have a right to use their ancestral land. So this is one barrier on how to solve a major issue, and another one is more like on like specific how to address the threats. For example, there's a lack of access to justice for indigenous people. There's a lack of knowledge from people in the indigenous community, which Katie will mention more about that, about using these tools to accede to justice. Even when there's, for example, lack of witness protection. So even if I want to advocate, so nobody's going to protect me. And even if assuming all this would be in place, there's endemic corruption in the Peruvian system, which actually is an impediment to exhaust all the domestic remedies before going to an international court eventually. So the law exists in Peru. The law is on the book. We have the laws, many. There is a clear problem of enforcement, which is due to a lack of resources, to corruption, to little access, little knowledge, and also a balance between, responsibility balancing between the central government to the region. Is the fault of the region, is the fault of the central government, and there's still a lot of work to do. We'll probably address more things later.
Thank you, Fabio. So moving on to question 3, which is, Fabio just gave a good lead in because we're going to move on to a discussion about indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples constitute a significant portion of the environmental human rights defenders and are particularly vulnerable in that respect. We're going to talk about this in the context of Peru and Kenya. With respect to Sri Lanka, the group did research the Vanayala Atu, otherwise known as Vedas, which, there you are, Anne. Anne talked a little bit about our traditional forest-dwelling group. Our research couldn't determine to the extent that the group was advocating for their land rights. So even though I think we presume that they are environmental human rights defenders, we couldn't make the determination. So we'll just leave it out of this particular discussion. So with respect to Kenya and Peru, I'm going to ask about whether you could describe the status of indigenous peoples in those particular countries. Let's start with Peru. Katie.
Okay, so in Peru in about the 1980s, there was a severe economic crisis which spurred the government to find profits elsewhere, which led to development projects, particularly in rural areas and in the Amazon, which are home to indigenous communities. In Peru, there's 51 indigenous communities, and on paper, Peru acknowledges the existence of these communities and their importance in Peruvian society. And even though Peru has done this on paper, we've realized there have been some issues as far as the proper recognition of these communities and the rights that they have. So first and foremost, Peru has 3 official languages, 2 of which recognize indigenous community languages. But in our research, we noticed that the predominant laws and printing of government information was only in Spanish, which creates a lack of access for these communities, both in the justice system and just in overall transparency from the government. So Peru introduced the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, which provides the rights of indigenous peoples and communities of self-identification. And it also provides rights therein as indigenous people, whether it be rights to the land and their ancestral land. Peru also has ratified the International Labor Organization Convention 169, which is one of the leading conventions, international treaties that provide the rights for indigenous peoples. In particular, it provides the notion of free, prior, and informed consent, which is extremely important for indigenous communities. What this does is this acknowledges the community's right to participation in the processes that affect them and their lands. Unfortunately, what we've recognized in this is a lack of due diligence on behalf of the government and on behalf of the companies who are required to implement this. One example is in the Peruvian context is that an extractive company who wants to use the land will institute free, prior, informed consent,
by taking one person from the indigenous community and use them to represent the entire indigenous community. Therefore, one person can consent to the project, whether or not that is in agreement with their power structure within that community itself. We also realized that there is a misuse of FPIC, so after an environmental impact assessment has been conducted, you are supposed to inherently provide the results back to those indigenous peoples as provided by FPIC, but these communities are not given that, therefore they are not fully informed, therefore violating the FPIC. Another issue we realize as far as the status of indigenous communities is a rural and urban divide. When we were in Lima and we talked to some people about the status of indigenous peoples, they were seen as more of a token of Peruvian society, not necessarily people that actually exist who actually conduct their life in the manners which history books have provided. And when we were in Pucallpa, also they acknowledge this divide where the people in Lima are making all the decisions that affect people in Pucallpa, and there's a disconnect between the two. So on paper, I would say Peru has done everything correct as far as identifying and recognizing indigenous communities, but those laws are not actually being implemented to provide the rights that these indigenous communities are afforded by international law and within the Peruvian law, because Peru acknowledges international law as being incorporated within Peruvian national law.
Thank you, Katie. Now for a different perspective on indigenous communities, I'll turn to Caitlin.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that, Katie. I really do feel like we're talking exact opposites here when it comes to Kenya. At least in the forest context, most of the HRDs that we saw were indigenous communities who have lived in the forest kind of intermittently for a very long time and kind of, off and on since colonialization. And we realized kind of when we were in Kenya that the conversation really shut down when we started talking about indigenous communities. And part of that comes from this conflict on the definition. The Kenyan government defines indigenous communities as hunters and gatherers, and only those people who have retained that type of lifestyle. But as you can imagine, with cell phones and modernization and whatever, very few people can actually be considered a hunter and gatherer anymore. So on the one hand, you have this problem because the government defines it so narrowly that modernization has meant that no one in Kenya is indigenous. But on the other hand, you have the international definition, which is much more self-defining. It kind of has aspects of being tied to land and culture, and pretty much everyone in Kenya fits that definition. So, they don't use the term because no one fits it, and they don't use the term because everyone fits it. So obviously, we're a bit sympathetic with the government in this regard because it is a complicated issue. But with that said, I think that there's been some interesting case law, especially out of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. In 2010, they ruled for an indigenous group that their kind of right to development,
in Kenya.
Yeah, in Kenya, thank you, was violated, and it was illegal for the government to have moved them off of their ancestral land. So I do think that it's difficult when it comes to international law, at least with the stance of the government, and especially also the very verifiable claims of illegal logging and poor planning for forest management, that their claims for community-based management do have some validity there.
Thank you, Caitlin. Now we're going to move on to question 4, which is about the role of businesses in the environmental human rights defenders context. This primarily arose in our Peru case study, but it also has implications in Sri Lanka, so we're going to focus on those 2 case studies. Kenya, in the forest context, businesses weren't prominent.
Legal ones.
Not legal ones, okay. Oh, right, I remember your blog. So let's talk about the role of businesses in the environmental human rights defender context, as well as any other non-state actors. Let's start with Sri Lanka and Sarah.
Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the role of businesses, and then I will briefly touch upon other non-state actors. So throughout our research, there were no specific company names that were mentioned, but there was a lot of evidence of national Sri Lankan companies' involvement in environmentally degrading projects that also had really great other benefits, such as job creation or electricity production. But nevertheless, these projects, such as the mini hydros, did contribute to environmental degradation. Other projects we came across as well had investment from foreign governments, from China and India and Japan. And we also came across other development projects that were funded by the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank or other regional and multinational banks to fund projects that, while had great benefits for other purposes, did have negative impacts for the environment and environmental human rights defenders. So I mentioned the mini hydroelectric projects. They were mostly, there's I think over 200 of them now, and mostly built by Sri Lankan companies. But we learned about cases in which forest department officials were being politically pressured by other people, either in the government or other politicians or people within their bureau, to give permits for these mini hydroelectric projects without doing the due diligence, so without carrying out an environmental impact assessment, without really understanding the impacts of these projects before instituting them. And there were several cases, well-documented cases of these from the Forest Department itself. But it's a complex problem. As Rucheta mentioned earlier, a lot of these issues come back to party politics and political pressure. So while the forest officials are doing their job, they also don't want to risk their job. So if they say no to someone who's asking for an illegal permit, they are going to risk their livelihoods and feeding their family potentially. So it gets very complex. In terms of the non-state actors, on a more positive side, most of the civil society organizations and NGOs that we talked to were all environmental advocates in one way, shape, or form. And especially since the war, the civil society environment in Sri Lanka is small and mighty and growing exponentially. So we interacted with organizations such as Environmental Foundation Limited, the Rainforest Protectors of Sri Lanka, and the Center for Environmental Justice that all advocate for various environmental and human rights issues within the public interest. And they either do this through legislative advocacy or through grassroots efforts such as protests, rallies, and demonstrations. And they've been really successful. One example is a coordinated project effort led by the Center for Environmental Justice and a group of Buddhist monks. And they, in order to protect a certain forest, they ordained 1,000 trees in this one part of Sri Lanka, and actually were able to protect the trees because they were then considered holy, and so no one could cut them down. So that was one really cool example that we came across.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Now turning to Fabio, of which businesses play a really large role in the context of EHRDs in Peru.
Yeah.
So please.
Yeah, well, in Peru is probably, I don't want to say it's common knowledge, but for sure, it's more known, the fact that big firms, big multinational, go to Peru to exploit several natural resources that the soil can offer. But it's important for us, I think, that we, and also for us, for everybody, when we're there, many Peruvian citizens like calling the attention on the fact, don't think about necessarily not only multinational businesses, but there are Peruvians that abuse of their own natural resources. So it's important that we keep in mind that when we talk about business, I mean, the first thing you think about multinational, which is actually a great chunk of the problem, a great part of the problem, but also local entrepreneurs, which sometimes, I mean, often they can be also like collaborating with multinational firms, have a major role in creating problems, either to environmental human rights defenders or exploiting resources not in a proper way. So, I mean, to give you like some points of what are the major issues in Peru, like something which is very it's a concern is regarding the environmental impact assessment of the activities carried out on the soil in the Amazon, which we have seen, we have experienced many loopholes in how these environmental impact assessments are conducted. For example, one instance of this is when prior consent is actually correctly implemented correctly. I mean, it depends also, but then the environmental impact assessment is sequential to the prior consent, which is actually not free, prior, and informed consent. So you're basically doing the environmental impact assessment after you got the consent of using the resources. This is one issue. There is also lack of independence in carrying out this environmental impact assessment. What I mean for that, I mean like the firms can hire third parties to conduct these assessments, which means that you can easily hire a third party and having a biased assessment, which then gives you the authorization to work on those lands. You submit this assessment to the Ministry of Agriculture, which is not, which simply like has the charge to receive this assessment, so not saying anything back. And speaking about Ministry of Agriculture, we actually verified the existence of conflict of interest within the same system in Peru, within the ministry. So we have on one side the Ministry of Agriculture trying to attract investments, so trying to lobby to lose laws and trying to attract investments, and on the other side we have the Ministry of Environment, which is supposed to protect the environment and work towards sustainable development goals, climate change prevention, and so on. It's interesting because this conflict of interest is also like reflected in a very peculiar practice that we verified in Peru, which is that firms, private companies, can hire police officers when they're not working as police officers. So you basically have a second job, which is security for the firms that exploit the lands in which the people you are supposed to protect as a police officer live. So, I mean, there's a clear contradiction in these two things, and this is, of course, one of the policy recommendations, which is repealed this presidential decree. Another thing with environmental impact assessment is that firms, if they work on small plots of land, they don't need to do this environmental impact assessment. So what they do is like they buy small plots of land and then they join them together, and you have a big plot of land, but you didn't have to pass through the environmental impact assessment. What can we do? I mean, of course, the United Nations are trying. Well, no, we have not. I mean, it's like what can we do? I was looking at there are guidelines to try. The United Nations developed the guidelines, the guiding principle on business and human rights, which are not a legally binding instrument, but it can be. It's more and more discussed in the international community as a way to any business enterprise, not just multinational, but again, like also local, to enforce. To have a business ethics that is consistent with the rights of the people and environment, of all rights, the people, environment, and so on. And also, like, talking about multilateral organization, the World Bank has a major role to play because, well, it's one of. There is also the Inter-American Development Bank, which basically, they have discussed 4 years about introducing human rights principle in the guidelines in the projects that they fund, but nothing happened. So we also, one major point of this report is like advocating for finally introducing human rights principle also in the project financed by the bank. And you know, to talk about NGOs, of course, as I said already, like in Peru is not a new problem. So there are a lot of NGOs working, a lot of civil society associations try to advocate for the rights of environmental human rights defenders, indigenous as a subcategory. But we also like run into some community leaders telling us that sometimes these international NGOs, maybe ending up also like defending more their interest than the interest of the community. There is a gap between what the community asks and what the NGOs do. So it's interesting also to flip the coin and see the other side. So that's all I have to say about it.
Is that all?
I think so. If you want, I can speak more.
No. Moving on to question 5, which is my favorite question. And I wrote it, so it's fine. So this is a topic that might seem intuitive, which is the role of forest rangers. And ideally, all forest rangers would be environmental human rights defenders, but it's a lot more contextual than that, as they face many challenges and different incentives. So we will talk about this in the context of Sri Lanka and Kenya. However, I should note that Peru also had issues with forest rangers, law enforcement activities, having adequate resources, and corruption. So they also had issues, so I'm not sure why we're not talking about them, but I think because the issues came up more in our research in Sri Lanka and Kenya. So this question is about what role forest rangers play in the environmental human rights defender context. And let's start with Sri Lanka and Rucheta.
So wildlife and forest officers in Sri Lanka are assigned specific territories and regions within protected areas, and their duties include monitoring the protected areas, preventing trespassing, poaching, and engaging with the larger community. As Anne mentioned, we visited a village that was in the buffer zone, as they call it, so engaging with the larger community to promote conservation of the environment. But there's a lot of problems in the Sri Lankan context that on a daily basis these forest rangers face. We spoke to Mr. Lalanath De Silva, who is the founding member of the Environment Foundation Limited, and he also founded another public interest law foundation. And he mentions having worked in the 1990s on behalf of the Wildlife and Forest Department officers on cases of officers who had rightfully fulfilled their duties but were mistreated or assaulted and violated by people in power and sometimes by superior officers from the army and police force. Further, some officers have also lost their life in the line of duty while preventing poachers from entering or by attack from wild animals. So as such, wildlife and forest officers face great risks on a daily basis in carrying out their duties to protect the environment. Further, these officers work really long hours, and as Anne mentioned in the introduction, when we went to the Knuckles Range, we discovered that only 3 officers were assigned to protect an area of 10,000 hectares. And one of the officers even mentioned that at times their shifts go beyond 24 hours because someone is supposed to be there, and if another officer doesn't show up, then someone has to be there to manage the forest. So this speaks a lot about the lack of manpower and capacity within the protected areas, and talks about the burden that it puts on the officials in carrying out their duties. We also had a chance to speak with Mr. Sumit Pilapithya, who is a World Bank retiree, and he's the ex-Wildlife Conservator General of Sri Lanka. And he resigned from his position because he encountered a lot of political interference in his decision making and in him carrying out his duties. And when we spoke to him, it became clear that the government salaries and compensations in case an officer loses his life in the line of duty are very weak and insufficient. And he said he had a World Bank retirement to fall back upon, but for most of the officers, this is their only job and it's their daily bread, which makes it difficult for them to carry out their work. And then we also discovered that in many times that there have been cases on wildlife officers and forest officers for taking bribes, for granting access into the protected areas for illegal activities that shouldn't otherwise be happening. While there was no direct evidence of a link between the government schemes and the bribes, in a developing country context, it's not hard to put the dots together. We also heard from someone at the Environmental Foundation Limited who mentioned that there's, when officers witness breaches of laws, often they get anonymous calls from them reporting on these breaches of their superiors, but because of their precarious positions in the complex government structure, they wish to be anonymous in fear of losing their job. So from our analysis, it seems that the Sri Lankan state is crippled by a lack of protection for whistleblowers and a lack of capacity on ground to protect the protected areas. So some of our recommendations were to implement whistleblower policies which would make it more possible for people to come out and report on such violations that their superiors carry out on them, and also to increase capacity and manpower and the government compensation schemes, because that would have a positive impact on the forest officers respecting their job and also preventing them from resorting to corruptive means such as bribes.
Thank you. Caitlin, on Kenya?
Yeah, so the Forest Scouts are part of the Kenya Forest Service, and their relationship with the communities that are dependent on the forests are often those communities' largest relationship with the government. So when that relationship goes south, there's a lot of trust that's lost for these communities with the government. And the Sangwar and Chuka communities, which are two that we wrote about in our case, our report, claim that the government, while they say they have kind of this mandate to conserve and protect, they're really there to profitize off of the forests, and they do that through, you know, forest farms or plantations, things like that. So, you know, we were kind of struggling with this conflict between this idea of profitizing and the opposite idea of conserving. And we really did see that it's pretty clear that corruption amongst forest officials is pretty high in Kenya. They're underfunded, there's no life insurance, which it's actually quite a dangerous job, especially when there's any sort of poachers or illegal loggers, that quite a few officers are killed every year. And also, they're placed outside of their community where they grew up, so they don't really have much of a connection to the land that they're trying to protect. So with that, that's kind of a recipe for corruption. It's like not much of a surprise. And even the way that illegal logging happens in Kenya is they often kind of a rich person in the town will pay unemployed youth to go in with a chainsaw and cut down a tree, and then over the course of several days they'll carry it out on their back. And you know, the forest is big, but one, you can hear chainsaws. Two, you can see people carrying a giant tree through the forest. And three, when it goes to market, it's supposed to have a tag. And the fact that it does have a tag means that someone sold them one illegally. So clearly there is a lot of corruption that's being engaged in by forest officials. And for this reason, communities have often started their own volunteer scout program. And usually these people don't have any other source of employment. They're not getting paid for doing this. So one of our suggestions is that we think in the long run, the Kenya Forest Service should try to hire these local forest scouts, which would give them both income and also make the protectors of the forest actually people who care about the forest and its long-term sustainability. And then just generally, Rasheta talked about kind of underfunding, and I think that's kind of a global phenomena when it comes to forest rangers. So I think funding, equipping, and training rangers to make sure that they're the best possible protectors of the forest that they can be is really important.
Thank you. So we have one last question before we move to Q&A. And this is a question in an attempt to pull all these different strings together. The question is, can you describe the tension between conservation, development, and human rights in the country case studies? And we'll start with Anna from the Kenya team.
Sure. So the issue of conservation, development, and human rights is really interspersed throughout all of the research that we've conducted and in all three case studies. In particular, in the case of Kenya, land policy and forced evictions seem to be at the heart of the issue for EHRDs. There are different organizations and agencies and groups that have different plans for use of the land, and they seem to be overlapping. For example, in terms of conservation, the Kenya Forest Service has a mandate to conserve. That's their primary goal, and we have mentioned that there have been some issues with corruption. For the communities, they hope to maintain their ties to their ancestrally claimed land, and they hope to sustain their livelihoods and use their traditional ways of life. In terms of development, the country has development goals that they wish to achieve, and projects and international financial institutions, in some cases, have sort of taken up this land and forced people living there to leave. So in the end, looking at all of these sort of overlapping issues, it seems that the question of who is the best conserver of the forest is key to the issue, and who should be in charge with this duty is a difficult decision to make. So in the example of the Sengwer community that we talk about in the report, we talk a little bit about a World Bank, joint World Bank and UNDP project that was based on conservation, and it was called the Natural Resource Management Project. And it started out with an appraisal of land, and it determined that the majority of the natural resources in Kenya were being depleted, and that 70% of the people in the country were living on 12% of total land area that was classified as medium to high potential for agricultural use. So clearly, the land could be used more effectively. So at a certain point in this project, the Sengwer community's land was considered relevant to the conservation objectives of the project, and they were asked to relocate and would be compensated for their hardship. However, after filing an official complaint, the community was able to reveal that there were several alleged human rights violations that had occurred. There were allegations of people being beaten, women that were mishandled, children being denied the right to go to school, and the right to food and property were not respected. The community also says that they have videotapes of these allegations and they've been ignored. The community has also gone and tried to petition to the National Land Commission that has the jurisdiction over the land rights policy in the country, and nothing has moved on that front. So they really feel that the system has sort of failed them. And in that way, it's a really difficult situation for them. So after filing the report, the World Bank group instructed an inspection panel to go in and investigate these claims that had been made. And in the end, they determined that the community was not properly informed of the process, and that led to a lot of the issues that you're hearing about now. So finally, concerning human rights, it's not that the Kenyan Constitution or the laws that are in the books don't have provisions for human rights, but perhaps the issue is implementation of such laws to protect the individuals that are affected. And that's one of the things we talk about in our policy recommendations as well. So one last thought is just to give you an idea of the two different perspectives that we'd been hearing throughout our interviews on the trip. And on one hand, from the government perspective, it seems that conservation is the goal and it needs to be prioritized. And in some ways, sometimes these groups that come in the way of that are affected, but the land is ultimately for everyone's use. And on the other hand, there is the community's perspective. And as stated by one of our interviewees, and this is a quote, "You can't protect a tree and fail to protect somebody who has been living where that tree is. Why would you choose to protect a tree or the forest and violate the rights of women, violate the rights of children, violate every other right just for one tree?" So that gives you the other side and the perspective of the community members that are affected. So as a conclusion, we found that at the heart of the problem in Kenya, it's really balancing the issue of environmental conservation, protection, the development goals that we all wish the country can achieve, and the ancestral land rights that the communities claim as well.
Thank you. Madisone?
Thank you. Yeah, so the tensions between development, human rights, and environmental conservation certainly came up a lot in Peru and really drove a lot of our conversations with all of the actors we talked to, whether it was indigenous communities or government officials or NGOs in Peru. So on the development side, Peru is classified as an upper middle income country, and it's growing rapidly at 6.3% of GDP per year. Still, there are millions of people impoverished in Peru, and many see resource extraction, particularly in the rich Amazon rainforest area, as a key way to bring so many of those people out of poverty, especially in the rural areas. This was true even for environmentalists we talked to, recognize the need for development in Peru to bring people out of poverty. Unfortunately, this often put forest defenders, specifically indigenous groups, who are statistically the best at conserving the environment, up against the efforts of extractive industry and of government in Peru. And there's clearly been a winner in this fight over the past few decades. Of the over 1,000 miles of square miles of rainforest cut down every year in Peru, 80% is done illegally. And also in 2014, a law was enacted to streamline the process of being able to clear cut forest and lowering the maximum fines for breaking environmental laws by half. And this is a huge loss for indigenous people in the Amazon who rely on it for their livelihood and for hunting and just for respecting their ancestral land and their way of life. And as we mentioned throughout this presentation, these rights have often been violated. According to the High Commissioner of Human Rights, even Peru needs to improve its framework for defending these human rights in relation to development priorities. I think this is really evident. I don't know if you mentioned it, but for instance, law number 28879, in which the government has allowed extractive industries in Peru to hire out official policemen throughout the country for up to 20 hours per week when they're off their official police duties to defend like extraction plants and to defend the companies. And this clearly, I think, this example in particular shows the priorities of state in protecting development and extractive industries versus activists in the field. And it all comes back to a conversation we had with Raquel Irigoyen, which she's an international lawyer and the founder of the International Institute on Law and Society in Peru. And because throughout the week we'd been hearing this same conversation whenever we met with government officials or even private researchers, they spoke, that there is this need to protect indigenous groups and forest defenders, but the right to development is also an international human right, a collective right, and so we need to enable these people to, improve their livelihoods, but at the end of the day, international human rights need to come first in terms of protecting their rights not to be persecuted, their rights to their ancestral land, and as mentioned earlier, the Peruvian Constitution has a clause which automatically implements all international human rights treaties signed by the Peruvian government into their constitution. So although it's important to recognize the need for development in Peru and the development of their people, we need to recognize as well that these human rights come first, and these human rights are part of their constitution and are necessary for the foundation of a strong democracy.
Thank you. Finally, Sarah on Sri Lanka, and to conclude.
So a lot of the issues that were just raised, the balancing act between development goals and environmental conservation is something we saw throughout the Sri Lanka case as well. A lot of these issues can be summarized as kind of general good governance problems with roots in corruption and lack of transparency. But these roots can be traced back mostly to the country's recent history of war and, even more importantly, to the history of British colonization. So given the country's history, it's no surprise that Sri Lanka is still struggling to fully implement environmentally friendly, sustainable development practices. And a lot of this has to do with things that we've all mentioned earlier, including misaligned incentives for the stakeholders who have an impact on environmental outcomes. And again, this is not only in Sri Lanka, but also things we saw in Peru and Kenya. And across all three of our country cases, we saw some key cross-cutting issues, namely the lack of transparency and protection for whistleblowers and human rights advocates in general. And this is really important because corruption undermines a state's duty to fully realize human rights. One of the most salient problems facing forest defenders in each of the country, as I mentioned, is this rampant corruption and loopholes in bureaucracies that prevent the effective implementation of even well-drafted policies, such as the environmental impact assessment laws and across the three cases. So in the spirit of transparency, out of 176 countries, Sri Lanka ranked 95th, Peru ranked 101, and Kenya ranked 145. Now that's from Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index of 2016. Somalia was 176, and Denmark was number 1, to give you some idea of where these three countries fall along the kind of global environment of corruption and lack of transparency. And these rankings speak to a lot of the issues that we faced in our fact-finding missions, such as contradictory statements or just difficulty accessing the facts. Some other key issues that came up were land grabs for development purposes and, as I mentioned, the problematic implementation of certain laws, such as the environmental impact assessments. But what really stands out is also the intersection of colonial history, corrupt institutions, and economic growing pains, which shape the human rights situation across our research in Kenya, Peru, and Sri Lanka. And these are key barriers to the country's ability to see sustainable rights-based development across the board. And for a moment of brief self-awareness, I'd like to add that these issues are not unique to the Global South, as we've seen throughout the past year or so, and throughout the entire history of the United States, let's be honest. But happening specifically in our backyard in North Dakota right now, our environmental human rights defenders, or were environmental human rights defenders standing up for their rights and their ancestral rights. So a lot of these issues that we've touched upon today, the contradictions and tension between sustainable development and environmental conservation and human rights, are things that we are looking at here in the States as well and across the developing world. So with that, I'd like to close and open it up to questions. Right.
Questions?
I have one question, kind of specifically related to Sri Lanka, but maybe it'll touch on other countries as well. And that's specifically related to sort of the small hydropower projects that were discussed, which I feel like everywhere is sort of seen as a sort of like new way of doing energy in a renewable way with less damage to environments than traditional hydropower. But I'm just curious to see or to hear if clearly the development of those things are usually driven by demand and like need for electricity. And I'd just be interested to hear if one, the communities affected are benefiting from that power that should theoretically be created, and two, if they're advocating instead for a different source of power.
I can start.
Okay. So to address your first question, actually taking a step back. So when we got to Sri Lanka, we realized that the case study that we imagined, which was focused on a particular national forest, was not at the forefront of the issue of environmental human rights defenders, which is why our case study is a bit different from Kenya and Peru. So when we got there, we started learning more about this mini hydro controversy. And yes, these projects are a new wave of like sustainable, seemingly sustainable electricity generation. And a lot of the reports that we heard are not based, we don't have a lot of scientific evidence for this. So some of it is hearsay, some of it is things that we found in the news and other activists who made these claims. One of the problems is that the amount of energy generated per mini hydro is so insignificant. There are much more, I guess, more effective ways of generating energy that are still environmentally sustainable. And the impact that we understood from these hydros is that they will prevent like the necessary waterfall for communities downstream. And so they, can't like feed their kids and wash their clothes and stuff. And from what we came across, we didn't hear of communities actually being able to benefit from the electricity generated, but we didn't specifically ask that question, and it makes me think that if the electricity is going to the national grid, then sure, these communities should be able to benefit, but at least when we were visiting like a tea plantation in the middle of the country, it didn't really seem like they had any running water or electricity. So I don't know, I don't see how the communities that are dwelling within the rural areas could actually benefit from any electricity generated on the grid. And
I think the other issue that we were hearing a lot about is the fact that there were just too many being built at one time, and that not many assessments were being done before they were carried out, so that communities get upset, especially if rice paddy farmers down the stream get their water sources cut off. Third point.
And also to the question of are they advocating for other types of energy production, we have not heard about that, but I'm sure they are.
If I may add on the Peru context, so the focus of this report was forest defenders. However, in our research of the entire context of Peru, that issue actually is raised. It's not necessarily mini hydros, but it is dams. And I'm not going to use specific cases because I'm going to forget the names and the numbers, but there's a significant number of dams that are being set to be constructed in Peru, not by the Peruvian government necessarily, but by private companies and other surrounding countries. And I know in one particular case, there's a company trying to build a dam, and none of the water or any of the benefits from the dam construction will benefit the communities that it impacts. And what it ends up doing is actually cutting off the water entirely from this village. So while that was an issue in Sri Lanka, it's also very prevalent in Peru. We just didn't happen to focus on it in this research.
And then, remember my third point, but the other issue that people were having was in terms of the cost of actually creating a mini hydro, and then what it was actually priced at for the development company that was carrying it out.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for your nice presentation. Yeah?
No. Pull it closer.
Just pull it closer. Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your very insightful presentation. I particularly enjoyed the fact how you positioned forces of development, globalization with environmental human rights protectors and those factors. I'm looking forward to reading your report. And thank you so much for the very nice introduction of Sri Lanka, me being a Sci student coming from Sri Lanka. So my question is particularly of laws and regulations and constitutions, which you guys touched on quite a bit of times, particularly when it comes to countries of former colonial countries, British colonies. Correct me if I'm wrong. So my understanding is that when it comes to laws, they do not stem from communities, especially former colonies. The fact that most of the regulations of environmental protection and any laws are not very familiar to the population at large. Like, for example, like maybe 95% of the population, especially rural populations, are not familiar with the laws and regulations that they have with environmental protection and the regulations that safeguard their rights. So my question is, what can be done to bridge the gap, and especially when it comes to laws of native people, the Vedda people in Peru and Kenya? What can be done to bridge the gap so that they have a better understanding, and also bring the constitution, not just a constitution in paper, but make it a living, breathing document closer with the hearts of the people? Thank you.
It's actually really interesting that you talk about that, because in Sri Lanka, they're drafting a new constitution, and part of the consultative process of this constitution drafting is that they talk to various groups throughout the country, whether it was like different ethnic minorities or religious minorities or linguistic minorities, to see, what they thought about their rights and how it could be incorporated into the Constitution. So I think that in itself is going to help. We'll have to see what happens, but just the fact that they're being asked about what's happening during the process might mean that they follow up, or that they then can see it reflected in the actual Constitution. You had something to say?
And in the specific case of Sri Lanka, given the demographic, there's multiple languages that are spoken, and we met with the Human Rights Commission, whose new mandate, as part of the new mandate, they are incorporating more regional offices and ensuring that there are officers that speak all the languages that are spoken in that area, because the chairperson of the commission did mention that oftentimes people don't seek legal help or come to the commission and report cases because of the idea that they won't understand what I'm saying. For example, for indigenous communities, they might not seem it as a friendly approach to go up because there's that language barrier, but the Human Rights Commission is working on that. And they're also working on ensuring that people, through these regional offices, there are programs that reach out to people and let them know about certain rights that are mandated by the Constitution, for example, right to life, all the basic human rights. So that is a way of making sure that the people know about the rights that are due to them. And this would help mainly in the rural context. She did mention, which was very surprising to us, that they receive multiple number of human rights cases, but they've never received any environmental human rights case. So maybe just the fact that they're now expanding their outreach and trying to bridge these language barriers could help in encouraging more people to report such violations. And I feel that speaks to Peru in terms of language barriers. And
I guess I could touch on that. So we noticed when we were in Pucallpa, there was this kind of random instance where the indigenous community leaders that we were with brought us to this woman. I'm gonna keep her name off just because I'm not sure if she wants her name out there, but she is an American who teaches the local communities how to read and write in their own native languages, because it's not taught in schools. The primary language is Spanish. And so what she told us is that a lot of indigenous peoples perform lower in school because they speak their language at home. They're not necessarily taught formally Spanish, and therefore they are not active and participating in the classrooms, which then leads to, lack of education for these people. And what we also realize is that indigenous communities, and particularly indigenous peoples, are not represented on any level of the government, whether it's the local, regional, or national. And that's extremely important for realizing the rights of those people, because if you don't have someone sitting at the table advocating for your rights, it's really hard to assume that someone else is going to be doing that. And you need someone who can fully represent those rights. And so I think implementing policies that promote the rights of indigenous communities in Peru would be absolutely crucial, as well as increasing participation of indigenous communities, because as we noticed when we met with indigenous leaders, they know their rights. It's a well-known thing. They just don't necessarily have the avenues or channels to advocate for themselves in, I guess, the proper forums, which also stigmatizes them because they're protesting instead of, other acceptable political avenues. And so I think as far as recognizing that, those are two of the main ways. So addressing the language barriers and trying to incorporate them through the educational process, and then also trying to incorporate them in the political process would be absolutely beneficial to protecting those rights. Because again, we said Peru has it on the books, but no one's making sure that these are actually being implemented correctly.
Yeah, and when it comes to Kenya, I would actually say that Kenya is a perfect example of doing it right. They think, to your point exactly, a large aspect of that is having a vibrant civil society to be able to help inform people of their rights, and which Kenya does. And there are a lot of NGOs working within the forest context to kind of help these communities. And then additionally, something that we didn't touch on much in this presentation, but we talk about a lot in our report, is Kenya has a system that they implemented in 2005 called the Joint Management System, the Participatory Forest Management System. So theoretically, representatives from the government and representatives from the community come together and they make all the decisions about the forest together, which is a really wonderful way of kind of including both interests and also kind of checking both sides. The problem is that like relationship dynamics, generally the government tends to be a tad bit more dominant in the whole system, but in theory, it's a wonderful idea that I think a lot of other countries could learn and take a lesson from.
Thank you. I'll touch on that question, and then I think we probably need to wrap up because of time. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the impetus for distinguishing environmental human rights defenders as a special group from just human rights defenders generally is because they're particularly vulnerable and at a heightened risk. In part because there's such a diverse group that includes a lot of marginalized groups, such that, I mean, well, if you think about other types of human rights defenders like lawyers or journalists, they have access to a lot of resources, and, you know, if they're under threat, there's, you know, a whole network that can, you know, help advocate for them and resources, whereas some of these marginalized groups lack the access to resources and basic services, so there's more systemic issues underlying their ability to access their rights, and those issues need to be addressed in order for their rights to be fully realized. And with that, we do have a reception, so you can mingle and ask more questions and have some wine and cheese. And thank you so much for coming, and we'll email, everybody who registered will email you the report when it's completed. If not, it's available on our website and will be promoted through SAIS. Thank you.
Wait, you guys, can we get a picture, like with this behind us?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, need to, I have my